Hello everyone. Hello and welcome to Alta Live. My name is Beth Spotswood and I am the digital editor, events gal here at Alta Journal. I'm so excited to welcome you to our conversation today where we are talking about incarcerated journalism and the problem with parole, the problem certainly with life with the possibility, or in many cases, impossibility of parole. I am really excited to welcome our guests today, Kate McQueen and Jesse Vasquez. One of the points of Alta Live is to expand on an article or topic from the magazine, the website. In this case, we're expanding on a really incredible, rich article focusing on the issue of people serving high-profile inmates serving life with parole. It's called The Never-Ending Story, and it was co-written by Kate McQueen and Joe Garcia. Joe is a currently incarcerated journalist who partnered with Kate on this story that kind of focuses on the case of former Manson family member Bruce Davis and his plight to one day be paroled. So joining us today to kind of expand upon that article is Kate McQueen. Kate is a writer on the faculty of UC Santa Cruz. She serves as an editorial advisor to Wall City, San Quentin's prisoner-run quarterly magazine, and she is the managing editor of the Prison Journalism Project's newspaper, PJP Inside. We're also joined by Jesse Vasquez. He's the executive director for Friends of San Quentin News and Pollen Initiative, a nonprofit organization, both of which are nonprofit organizations advancing transformational incarcerated-run multimedia programs such as San Quentin News and Forward This Productions. Jesse was incarcerated as a juvenile and spent almost 19 years in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation program until former Governor Jerry Brown commuted his sentence. Since his release in 2019, Jesse has volunteered in various high schools to help teens understand their options and opportunities in spite of their environmental surroundings. You can read more about him on our website and check out the Pollen Initiative as well. We're going to send you links to all of that. Quickly, Alta Live is the event series we do at Alta Journal. If you haven't heard of us, we are a quarterly magazine focused on California and the West. You can subscribe to our magazine as a member for $50 a year and get 4 beautiful issues of Alta Journal, a really cool hat, a book about our favorite bookstores of California and the West. You can subscribe as a digital member for $3 a month, support the kind of work we do, including writers like Kate and Joe Garcia, who write for our magazine. Or just come to free events like this. In fact, tomorrow evening, if you're in the LA area, we're having an event, 7 p.m. North Figueroa Bookshop, celebrating the Baja issue with readings from 3 of our contributors. There's going to be wine, water, conversation. That event is free to all. We're also having a Baja wine tasting and reading from the magazine at Alta Baja Market in Santa Ana, California. And that's on March 2nd. So we'll send you invitations to those. With that spiel out of the way, Kate and Jesse, it is so exciting to see you both here today. I love asking the audience to say where they're zooming in from. I see Santa Barbara, San Francisco. I'm in Novato, California. Kate, where are you today?
I am in Los Gatos, California.
And Jesse, what about you?
East Oakland, California.
Welcome to both of you. It's an honor to have you both here, and I'm really grateful that you took the time. Kate, if it's cool with you, I'd like to kind of dive right in and ask you, first of all, how you know Joe Garcia. Unfortunately, Joe wasn't able to join us today. It's difficult to get an incarcerated journalist or incarcerated person to join us in a Zoom interview series. But Kate, can you tell us how you connected with Joe and about his interest specifically in Bruce Davis's case?
Sure. Yeah. So I know Joe from my work at San Quentin with the media center there. I'm an editorial advisor with the quarterly magazine that San Quentin News puts out called Wall City. And Joe, back in the day when the story started, was also a staff writer for the San Quentin News. So we had worked in person actually before on other stories. And when the idea for this story came about, we were thinking it would be a good idea to partner on this piece, perhaps for an outside audience, a bigger outside audience than what we had at Wall City. And we did get started in 2019, which is actually, gosh, now, what, 5 years ago? It's a long, long story in the making.
You got started on this story in 2019?
That's right.
Was it specifically for Alta then, or you just started working with Joe on the idea
The
of
idea
story?
started, yeah. So 2019 was the 50th anniversary of the Manson family crimes, and it was also the year that Bruce Davis transferred to San Quentin. So previously he'd spent most of his incarceration at the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. So it just so happened that in 2019 he was transferred and was among the general population at San Quentin, and Joe had an opportunity to get to know him there.
Was Joe already a journalist at this point or working as an incarcerated journalist?
That's right. Yeah, Joe was on the San Quentin News staff. So he went through the Journalism Guild's training there and was a staff writer on also wrote longer features for the magazine Wall City.
Did you find were you like, you know, training Joe to kind of go into the yard and look for stories, to be on the lookout for important kind of stories from the inside that he wanted to share to a wider audience?
Joe has a natural knack for picking up good stories. This was all his idea. Interviewing Bruce was all his idea. And the more we bounced around the story, the more the idea kind of grew to be something bigger than just a profile of Bruce Davis, but actually be a story about the complications of trying to go before the board. And, from my perspective, being someone who studies narrative and teaches narrative journalism, it clearly became a story about storytelling. And that was where my interest was super piqued. And I thought, we could probably make this a much bigger piece than just a profile.
Right. For those that haven't yet read the article, and we will send you a link to that, and perhaps my wonderful colleague, Associate Editor Jess Blau, could drop a link to it in the comments. Can you just tell us a bit about Bruce Davis for those that might not know who he is?
Sure. Yeah, he's not one of the more known Manson family members. He was a member of the family. He did not participate in the Tate LaBianca murders, but he did participate in the first and the fourth of the murders that took place, and he was sentenced to 7 years to life in prison for those crimes um, back in the early 1970s. So he's been parole eligible for quite a long time, and has in the last 51 years, I guess, gone before the parole board now 36 times. And the six of those times, so minus one, the last 7 times he went before the board, he was found suitable. So the board of parole hearings did consider him no longer a threat to society, and his release was blocked by the governor in those cases. So his story is a very extreme story of the parole process, but we thought it is a really interesting way to highlight some of the complications that come up when people try and tell their story. People who are serving time for high profile crimes do have to not only prove that they are rehabilitated and that they're no longer a danger, but they also have to figure out a way to counter the public narrative about their crime. So in an essence, it's two stories competing against each other.
Yeah. Jesse, I'm gonna dive in with you. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of the parole process and the barriers to parole that incarcerated prisoners face or must kind of overcome to achieve what you have done, which is to be a productive member of society on the outside?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me. I'm glad that I can stand in for Joe, who was one of my colleagues at San Quentin News. And the parole board process, when we talk about like obstacles or barriers, like there's a couple of things, right, to keep in mind that I like to categorize and preface with. Number one is like those that are legal, when it comes to like mandatory minimum sentences. So 7 to life, 25 to life, 35 to life, 45 to life means that you're going to do 85% of your time before you're even eligible for parole. On top of that, we also have like procedural barriers. They don't give you a checklist when you go into prison saying like, hey, you can do X, Y, and Z to earn parole earlier, and you'll be guaranteed a date when you come to the parole board. So there's that, like you go into the system blind, not knowing what the parole board's going to expect. And then there's also like the moving goalpost theory when it comes to the parole hearings themselves. When you get into the parole board hearing, there's not a checklist that the commissioners actually follow to determine whether you have enough insight. Like Kate mentioned earlier about, one narrative against another. You have one story that's been put in front of the parole board, which is what's in the police record, what's in the court transcripts, what's in your probation report. And maybe not once have you been able to tell your story until that first parole board hearing. So let's say that you don't have enough insight, which is a vague term, right? Like nobody knows what insight really means. It can mean something different to each commissioner. And one commissioner may say like, oh, you have enough insight. The next commissioner
What do you
may say,
mean by insight? You need to present some kind of insight?
no. So you have to show like insight for most of the folks that have done life sentences that have paroled. Insight is when you can give insight into why you committed your crime, the causative factors surrounding your crime, the contributing factors that, made you the person that you were capable of committing that crime, and then understanding like what it is that you've done to mitigate those factors so that you won't do it again. And you have to be able to articulate that in a way that is in context with the official record. So in spite of what you did, like nobody was present in certain crimes, right? So there's no eyewitnesses. But what's written in the court transcripts, that's what you have to be able to regurgitate and add some insight from what you believe, propelled you to do that. And if the board is convinced, then they might find you suitable. But the barrier, even if you are found suitable after that, is there may be some cultural political elements to your crime or the culture of the time. It may not be the right political time where you're going to get a parole date. So because parole is an arbitrary process, it's not guaranteed that you get paroled. So during the past maybe 25 years, like I was in the system during the late 90s, 2000s, we didn't see anybody parole until 2014. No lifers were going home until Governor Jerry Brown came into office. And that was because it was a state mandate for the governors, whether it was Arnold Schwarzenegger, Gray Davis, or Pete Wilson, where they had said that you weren't leaving prison with a life sentence unless it was in a pine box.
Despite the sentence being 7 to life or 25 to life.
Correct. And that was because, so the way that the statutes are written in California, you have a mandatory minimum of sentence that you have to serve, but there's no mandatory maximum. So for instance, on Bruce Davis on the 7 to life, they can hold him for 55 years, 60 years, right? Like that's the thing with the way that it's written. It's open-ended for a maximum of unlimited numbers, but you have to have a mandatory minimum.
I'm it's interesting what you're saying about 2014 and Jerry Brown coming into office. Inside of prison, two questions, I guess. Do inmates communicate with each other about how to best set yourself up for success in terms of gaining parole, presenting insight in a way that is relevant and will kind of convince the parole board? And do prisons, I have through this article and through like talking to Kate and some other people have learned that San Quentin is a particularly unique prison in that there are so many services and programs offered to incarcerated people, in contrast to some other prisons. Is there a program inside prison that helps people prepare for parole and do things within the walls that will help facilitate their eventual release or likelihood thereof?
It depends on the prison, accessibility, to those types of programs. But before the department became the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, like the R wasn't added till 2005. So before that, we didn't have any type of like access to genuine programs that were funded by the state. It was mostly provided services by nonprofit organizations that came in to provide like NA, church programs, maybe some anger management and things like that. After 2005, the department started making substantial investments and headway. But before that, we used to have groups on the yard. Like I remember a couple of lifers, people who were going to the board, they would have their own unofficial, informal groups of gathering to talk about insight, causative factors, contributing factors, and things like that, just to share the understanding that they had gained from their 2 or 3 times of being before the parole board and getting denied. So it became like a first as a shared pool of information, and then it became like more official. By 2010, 2011, we started seeing groups like GRIP, like Guiding Rage into Power. We started seeing other programs that were giving people like an official platform to examine their causative factors, their family history, their upbringing, so that they could gain that insight and then present themselves in a little better way.
I realize that this is such a gigantic topic, and I feel like we can talk about like the whole
Mm-hmm.
parole process forever. I want to ask one more question about that, and then I want to dive into incarcerated journalists. Kate,
Mhm.
for you, can you just explain the differences and challenges regarding a high profile prisoner like Bruce Davis? I realize, I mean, we used it in the magazine, having Manson connected to the crimes that you were convicted of is a really big barrier. Can you just talk a little bit about the impact of the fame associated with certain crimes?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why Joe found Bruce to be an interesting source, and one of the things I also found really interesting in the story is the fact that most people see Bruce as just kind of a normal guy. He's a very active member of the general population. He takes classes. He's always worked a job. He's very active in his church community. So people who he interacts with on a day-to-day basis see him as just this really nice guy who kind of lives next door. Um, and it's just such a stark contrast to what people on the outside understand about Bruce Davis. So that's one thing as kind of an interesting difference, that his story has continued inside, but it did not continue on the outside. If you look him up today, the way other reporters have written about him is basically just very narrowly in the context of the crime that he was sentenced for. Um, and he's also very cautious, as you can probably imagine, about speaking to journalists. So as far as I understand, Joe is the first journalist he's ever spoken to on the record. Um, and that's one of the reasons why actually it's so great to have journalists on the inside, the access that they have and they can bring to the stories, the level of trust and credibility that Joe was able to build with Bruce over the course of many, many months of spending time with him, getting Bruce to trust him, to understand that he was really interested in Bruce Davis's whole story and not just the story of his crime. So those were some things also in terms of like the fact checking process, doing that from the outside. We just had to be really careful that we took Bruce Davis along through all the steps so he understood what our job was as a journalistic organization, as a magazine, as writers, to do the best work by our readers, but also make sure that we were taking care of him in the process.
So let's talk about incarcerated journalism. Um, Jesse, I realize I'm just like springing this question on you, but do you know any kind of history of at least in the United States or California, how long have prisoners been, I either had programs helping them. San Quentin is a kind of a shining example with the San Quentin News, the Ear Hustle podcast, of media coming from the inside. But do you know anything about the history of that, when that began, how early it goes back, how far it goes back,
Well,
rather?
luckily enough for us, we have a historian on the call. So Kate McQueen actually is the one who educated
Oh,
me on the history of prison journalism and prison newspapers going back 100 years or so. Kate, you want
8.
to chime in?
Sure. I have written a little bit about this on the side. Sorry, Beth didn't share that
No,
information
no, no.
before the
Take it
call.
over. Do it.
Prison newspapers have been in the United States basically since America's had a press. So the first prison newspaper started in 1800. But in terms of people who we would actually recognize as journalists in our modern definition, I would say early 20th century. There were
Really?
some people like Jack London was one of the first oldest pieces of inside journalism that I've seen is from him. He wrote a piece about his experience being incarcerated in like 1907, around the turn of the century, but it's kind of like around the middle of the 1900s, 1940, that you start to see people who learned their journalism inside, who ran prison newspapers, start to also write for outside organizations like Collier's, like gosh, who else? The Atlantic, NPR when it started to be a thing. So some writers, just to name a few off the top of my head, like Wilbert Rodeau is the most famous one. He was the longtime editor of The Angelite, a prison magazine out of Louisiana State Penitentiary. And he's one of the most decorated journalists, just generally, that we have in the States. He's 82 now, but he won a George Polk Award. He was nominated for all sorts of national magazine awards. Yeah, so we have had people in the past writing inside for outside publications with quite a lot of success. But the work that Jesse and San Quentin News has done in the last, I would say, 10, 15 years is pretty groundbreaking. So maybe I'll kick it back to you, Jesse. And you
Yeah, Jesse, take over. Present day
Yeah,
incarcerated.
yeah, it's interesting. So Joe is in a league of his own, right? As a freelance writer. Like Joe's always been an incredible writer, and it doesn't surprise me that he's been incredibly successful with this article with Kate and also with the one that he wrote about the Swifties, Taylor Swift, But the work that we do at San Quentin News, I think we have a full-fledged newsroom where we have 20 staff, who write for the paper. We produce a monthly publication. And in that like structured way, it's not just like prison journalism. We run everything else, from like management, operations, professional development, and things like that. So we kind of like create the groundwork that the individuals need to like branch out and become freelance writers and things like that. The idea of a free press in an incarceration state is, a bit of an oxymoron, but we try to do the best that we can to work within those parameters to make it happen. So I think the official like setting that we're trying to create, like creating newsrooms in other prisons, we're trying to lay groundwork so that more and more people can actually get into the freelancing of telling stories of the incarcerated. I think it's not just about narrative change. I think it's more about like, civic engagement for a lot of the writers. It's capturing the stories and the authenticity, building that trust with our communities and telling those stories that otherwise would just be, lost for us.
I realize that there's a lot of training that comes with being a journalist, certainly, but there's also, natural talent, like we clearly Joe has. How many people do you see incarcerated journalists? I mean, really have a knack for this. I mean, find kind of a passion and a purpose within this. I imagine a lot of people sign up to participate just for something to do. And I know San Quentin has an extraordinary amount of programs compared with other prisons. But I also imagine that you're really finding some genuine talent. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So like that's how I came to it. I used to be a creative writer. I used to love, telling my own stories just because writing was a way for me to process a lot of my traumas that I can't share with people. And then I got involved in the Journalism Guild, and that's how people polished me and helped me. And I think the way that we find our talent is there's consistency, like they constantly produce something, and then they're naturally inquisitive. Like you gotta be inquisitive about the world, about people, and you gotta like ask a lot of questions. And in prison, that can be also like a dangerous factor, right? Because if you're too nosy, it's like, why are you asking so many questions? So people have to understand the context of why you're curious about them, about your environment, about things like that. Most of the folks that come through the Journalism Guild, I want to say they do it out of curiosity because they want to learn a different craft. Everybody's a storyteller in prison because you don't have a past. The only thing you have is your past. You're telling stories about just your past life because you can't see your future. So everybody wants to tell a story, but then it's like, how do you teach them journalism so that they can tell other people's stories? So they come with curiosity, and then, for our professors or instructors, like it takes them having a human interest in the individual to help hone that skill set and develop them into like a good storyteller, and a good fact checker. We're still working on fact checking, by the way, but we're we're more on the curiosity and creative side right now with our writers. But we find that like the best talent are those ones that for the longest time have been so introspective that now they're curious about the world and they want to know.
Are freelance incarcerated journalists who work freelance, how are they compensated? Do they get a check like
Uh,
I get a check if I write something?
Yeah, yeah, it's sort of like that, right? So it's a creative process. So I can only speak to like how California functions because
Uh-huh.
California is all I know working in the state. So for San Quentin News, like because it's an official state prison newspaper, they have what we would call incarcerated pay numbers. So the state pays them, 50 cents an hour, to work on the newspaper for 5 hours a day. And if they're freelance writers, though, then it would be like maybe a 1099 employee, depending on the amount that they're going to get paid, then it's like a 1099 and they go through their own formal process. The money usually either gets deposited on their inmate accounts or in a bank account of their designation as long as they follow the rules. um Nobody in California can tell them that they can't produce writing, that they're not going to write, that they can't make money off of their writing. The only rule in the Title 15, which is the rule book for the California prison system, is that they're not allowed to profit off of anything that they make on state property, like a state computer, a state typewriter, and things like that. And then there's also a clause that says that they're not allowed to like profit off of their life crime if that's, something that they're trying to do. But other than that, they are allowed to freelance and get paid a normal, salary or word count or dollar per word, whatever.
I know you both have worked with many, many, many incarcerated journalists. Have any of their victims or victims' families reached out with either a positive or negative response to seeing um, the incarcerated journalist involved in the crime in their life have published work?
I
Okay.
I personally haven't had this experience. But if people are curious to read an account of something on these lines, actually probably the most well-known and celebrated freelance journalist inside prison right now, his name is John J. Lennon. He's incarcerated in New York State, and he freelances for places like The Atlantic and Esquire and New York Times Magazine. Um, he wrote a piece for the Washington Post magazine a few years back called The Apology Letter, which is about him trying to make a connection to his victims' families and what came out of that experience. It's a fascinating piece about what making amends looks like or doesn't look like when you're also making money off of your writing. So, and I actually think it was nominated for a National Magazine Award, and I think it might have even won one that year. So it's called The Apology Letter, Washington Post Magazine, John J. Lennon. Check that out.
We'll find it and send a link if we can this
Yeah,
afternoon.
and there are other instances I see actually in the chat. Someone bringing up the story of Danny Martin and Peter Sussman here, our own SF Chronicles experiences with trying to pay incarcerated writers that can get very complicated, and that one ended up in a massive First Amendment lawsuit. This was back in the 80s. So, it has been a point of contention in the past. Who is allowed to tell what stories is something that we face all the time. And I'll let Jesse weigh in too.
Yeah. Well, and as editor-in-chief, I had the privilege of reading every letter that we used to get at San Quentin News. And now as executive director managing all the platforms, the websites, and the social media channels, I get to see all the accolades and also all the hate mail. So I can attest to the fact that there are people who believe that the incarcerated, number one, should not have a platform, primarily because for them it's a matter of, well, if my loved one can't speak, for themselves anymore, why should you? The other argument that we always hear is like, they don't deserve anything just because of what they committed, and I think I don't ever argue with, people's feelings. Like everybody's entitled to feel how they, want to feel and stuff like that. I think that's what makes us human. What also makes us human, though, is the capacity to forgive, the capacity to redeem, and the capacity to hope. So I'd like to balance those two things out. So I don't ever respond to those type of mail emails and things like that. But we have gotten also some survivors' families, because some don't want to be called victims; they'd rather be called survivors. So We've gotten mail from them, you know, that says like, hey, I'm really glad that this person has a byline in the newspaper. You know, how are they doing? What's going on with them? You know, is there any way I can get in touch with them? And we're not allowed to put them in touch with anybody. You know, they have to go through the Office of Victim Services in Sacramento. But we do get a balance, you know, and I want to say that we're moving towards a culture, you know, in California at least, where people are more open to the idea of rehabilitation and redemption. So those text messages, those Instagram posts, and those emails are far and few in between now than they were like 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago.
Fascinating. Um, it seems to me, it seems very, very important to both of you with the work you do, to help incarcerated prisoners share stories from the inside. Is there any, I mean, I don't know how they would do it, but in terms of, do they do, in addition to like journalism, does the San Quentin News publish creative writing, poetry? What kind of, and how has the San Quentin News and the media kind of opportunities, we can use San Quentin as an example because I know you both know it so well. How have those kind of opportunities evolved over at least your time working there?
Okay.
There are just all sorts of different publications, award opportunities. There are lots. If you go looking for prison writing, you can generally find it. It's not as common in our mainstream media as I would like it to be. So I was extremely grateful and excited that Alta was willing to take a chance on this piece.
Why do
But
you think that is? That it's not as common? I mean, we were so excited to have it, you know.
yeah, it's hard. It is hard work. I mean, we didn't have a chance to really talk about this, but I mentioned the fact that the story idea was started 5 years ago, and it took us like basically 3 years to complete the story, just because a lot of what we did was going back and forth by snail mail, you know. And of course, the pandemic came into that, and all sorts of other factors too. But you have to really want to do this work.
Mhm.
Um, and you know, in our moment of kind of fast journalism and journalism industry, we're all under a lot of strain because everybody's trying to do a lot of stuff. Now we don't have a lot of boots on the ground in journalism anymore, and so it can take a lot of extra energy if you want to get a story out from a place that is hard to reach.
This is, I mean, I think that both of the, just the topics of incarcerated journalists, and the work that they're doing and the kind of the different perspective they have is so important, as well as just the complexities of life with parole and how that is different for high profile inmates, is so fascinating. We could talk about it forever, but, and I realize that we're out of time and you both are very busy people. So before we go, I was hoping that one or both of you could give us an update on Bruce Davis's status as it relates to parole and Joe Garcia's, both of whom are serving life with the possibility of parole and hope to achieve parole.
I just excuse me, I just checked online this morning. If anyone's curious, you can look to see the status of people's sentences. The CDCR is very transparent about all that information. You can find it online. It looks like Bruce's next potential date is set for August. He was supposed to go before the board, or perhaps did go before the board on January 18th. But online it says his hearing was continued. I think that can mean a lot of different things. Jesse can correct me if I'm wrong. And Joe's gonna go before the board this spring.
How, now that you're kind of, do you offer advice when you're working with, Jesse, this question is for you, when you are working with incarcerated journalists, having once been on the inside, now being on the outside, do you offer any of that kind of experiential advice? Kind of like those yard discussions you had described earlier where people share knowledge?
Yeah, I think my work, it'd be impossible for me to take the human side out of my work. You know, like I have to go in there and be authentic because we expect authenticity from them as well. So any question that they ask me, I'm willing to answer, but I don't offer unsolicited advice. I just tell people because the parole board, what I found when I went to the parole board, I went one time and I got found suitable the first time, not because I think it was also because I had a commutation from Governor Jerry Brown and I had my story made sense, you know, to everybody. you know, and I was able to tell it in an authentic way. But I tell people all the time, if you are authentic and genuine, like you're just going to shoot your shot, and whether they believe you or not doesn't matter. You just got to live with your truth and be okay with that. Like that's the best advice that I've given people all the time, right? And it's how you frame your story. So I do try and, you know, provide some counseling, mentorship, and things like that, you know, apart from trying to give them just editorial direction and some management and structure. I think my role in there is more personal than just like management. It's, you know, trying to help them see like, hey, there's some hope and we can be beacons of that.
And I imagine you speak kind of more fluently a language of being an incarcerated person that, you know, has the credibility, that has the weight with incarcerated journalists and anyone who's in prison that perhaps, you know, someone coming in from the outside might not have. With that, Kate McQueen, thank you so much for your incredible work for Alta. Jesse Vasquez, thank you so much for joining us today. Folks, this interview has been recorded and will be posted to altaonline.com later this afternoon, free for everyone. You can find it on our website. We're going to shoot you emails with links to Kate and Joe's article in Alta. You can read the apology letter in Washington Post. We'll send you a link to that. Anything else that pops up, the Pollen Initiative, San Quentin News, Jesse's work, Kate's work with incarcerated journalists. Join us next week for Alta Live, where we're excited to welcome Jason and Hollis Asnap, father and son. Jason is a writer. His father is an artist. They're going to talk about the Native American art scene in rural Oklahoma in the 1960s and 70s, where they'll be joining us from Santa Fe and Oklahoma, respectively. So that is a week from today. Again, Kate McQueen and Jesse Vasquez, very grateful for your taking the time to speak with us today.
Beth?
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Take care, everyone. See you next time.